Okay. This is a weird house. And there are a lot of weird houses. You know, remember I told you when we started this class that we were going to be looking at strange architecture. There's lots and lots of odd houses, most of which we're not going to be interested in. So one of the goals of this class today is to begin the problem of discussing houses. Houses are really important, particularly vacation houses. I think I might have told you this before. Vacation houses are important because nobody has to live in them a long time. You go there for a weekend or you go there for an occasion. Lots of rich people have them. So rich people are willing to afford or spend some money on architectural experimentation. So they'll commission young architects to do vacation houses. You know, like I said, they don't have to live in them too long. And so lots of experimentation occurs in vacation houses. And this has been true for centuries. In fact, even though the villa or the individual house, which was a house for wealthy persons that developed in Rome, it began to become important in the 15th century, 16th century. And since that time, we've looked at houses, but primarily vacation houses, for the kernels of architectural ideas and how they reflect our changing relationship to buildings. Now, does anybody know what this architecture is about? Yeah, see, so you can get your architectural ideas from anywhere, including silly nursery rhymes. Now, I'm not quite sure why you would want to do this, but the one thing I find particularly interesting about this is it's a platform. It's got platform heels. So it's not a bad shoe when you think about it. It's a pretty good shoe. Well, one thing you see a whole lot is people wanting to turn stuff upside down. I mean, this is one of the most common themes in silly. This is not a work of architecture. This is kind of a silly building. I'm hoping today we can begin the problem of distinguishing between the two. But you can see a lot of upside down houses when you go around the world. Wherever you are, this is in Korea. Working out the door is always an interesting problem. Whereas we're going to be looking at, and I'm going to call this an unusual house. This is perhaps the most beloved house of all the 20th century. This is Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's in Pennsylvania. You should go see it. It's not very far. And it's a really beautiful work of architecture. But most of the stuff, when I say odd architecture, it'll be more like this. It'll be, although I'll show you some upside down houses. Now, remember when we started talking about houses and I showed you the Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is kind of interesting because at the end she says there's no place like home. Now, home is an interesting part. Remember, she's daydreaming about her future. She takes a long journey. It's exotic and scary, and then she comes back home. And she says, there's no place like home, there's no place like home. Now, home is an interesting problem because home, in a certain sense, doesn't belong to architecture, and as we know, a house is not a home. But on the other hand, we have a very strong attachment to our houses in relationship to the question of home. So there's a psychological and a social investment that we make in our houses so that when we get there, we actually feel incredibly relaxed. We can be ourselves. You know, it's an important space of, let's say, psychological and social activity for each of us as individuals. Home is also an interesting problem because it shows up so many places. Notice this is a baseball field, you get to home plate. And actually, if in music, you start at something called a home key, and you leave and you come back to the home key. And virtually every song you'll ever listen to repeats that pattern. Unless you listen to contemporary music or stuff like trance or electronic music mostly, almost all the music you're going to listen to starts someplace, leaves, and comes back. And that sense of coming back, so you just hear this story of starting at a home, leaving and coming back home over and over and over again. So we have a vast investment in this problem. Remember when we were looking at The Shining, I'm just reviewing a little bit of last week, that each character had a space that they became identified with, and things went bad when they left those spaces. And so it's not just, for example, I suggest that in your house you do not do what you're supposed to do in the rooms you're supposed to do it in. I bet you don't always eat in the dining room, don't always sleep in the bedroom. I bet you eat in the bedroom, watch TV in the bedroom, do your homework in the dining room, read in the bathroom. So you have a relationship to the house. In fact, if you're young and dating, the house becomes another interesting place for all sorts of interesting experiments, of which I went about as far as I can go. So now we've now discussed, so basically we're beginning to discuss this idea called program. A house is a place you live, and that's the program. A school is a place you go learn, and that's the program. And we're going to develop that a little bit more. Now we're going to introduce two really important new ideas, and that's this question of form. Because these two forms, the pyramid and the cube, are really going to be almost all architecture, not all, and as always is the case, the newer it is, the more unlikely this is going to be the case, but almost all architecture that you'll ever encounter, you will be able to understand in terms of these two forms. The most important form is the one on the left, the pyramid, and then the one on the right is the cube. The pyramid is most important because it has incredible symbolic value. You recognize it as a symbol. It's sort of pure geometry. Both of these are pure geometry. But more importantly, it meets the ground in such a way as to reinforce the importance of the ground. And it meets the sky in such a way as to suggest that there's a kind of disappearance of matter into kind of spirituality, whether it's God or gods or the realm of the death. Somehow or another, the way it dissolves at the top it kind of suggests the infinite above it. And so we call this the relationship to the ground and the sky. And it's unbelievably important. And in fact, the pyramid is, I would say, you had to figure out, if you had to learn one thing in architecture, is to learn all the possibilities of the pyramid. Now, the cube is something a little bit different. The cube is really important because it's got more space in it. It's a good way to think about living on the one hand. It's kind of, if your house was a pyramid, you'd keep bumping your head. So the cube is important, but more importantly, it's abstract. You notice it doesn't sit on the ground. I know that was a really bad joke, but you know, what the heck. I work on quantity. I tell 200 jokes, one or two of which works. That's good enough. I'm not a great comedian. So the top is the same as the bottom, same as the six sides. Notice in this picture, it kind of sits in an abstract space. And so there's a way the cube is, in a certain way, exactly opposite of the pyramid in terms of the architecture. It's because it doesn't reinforce the ground, it doesn't separate the ground and the sky or the sides. It doesn't seem to be about anything except itself, and it has a kind of intellectual quality to it, whereas the architecture, the pyramid, much more theatrical quality. It works in terms of symbolism, but it also, it's made of stuff. Okay, so we're gonna, now, actually you'll see this a lot, and if you look really carefully in this, and I get to use my laser for the first time, this is, you saw this in the Olympics, there is a pyramidal quality to the bird's nest, which a building we're gonna go back over. Notice it's bigger at the bottom than it is at the top, and next to it was the cube. And in fact, they behave exactly in the way that we're gonna describe in the Olympics when we go back to discuss that. Notice that this, in a very subtle way, is an effort to do both. This has a pyramidal quality. Here, you can probably see it better in this abstract model. This is falling water again. On the one hand, it's small, it's bigger at the bottom and smaller at the top. On the other hand, it's composed of these volumes that suggest its interest in the cube. It's kind of an interest in abstraction, interest in these sort of spaces. And so it's a very subtle take on that problem. Now, I told you that we would see, this is actually an upside-down house by an architect named Piet Bloem from Holland. And it's much more sophisticated than the other ones that we were talking about. But on the one hand, you can see immediately that one of the things he doesn't do is just doesn't turn it upside down. He rotates it 45 degrees and puts it up on its corner. He puts windows up here, so the floors are kind of like this. But he also is working out the problem of the relationship between the cube and the pyramid. So it does both in the rotation, but it becomes increasingly abstract, more intellectual, and And yet the sophistication with which he does the same problem that we saw early on where the people turn the house upside down should be apparent to you. It's hard to figure out where the door is. The windows don't suggest, there's no upside downness to this. So the form is beginning to operate separately from a house that's been turned upside down. And he also puts them in these clusters. So this is these are all those buildings in this cluster, and is able to produce these kinds of effects. So when you're here, and you're looking up, and it's also true here, 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 and here, you see this kind of star. So an architect that's going to do these things is going to try to get a lot more out of it than just the gimmick of turning it upside down. It's going to matter on the inside, it's going to matter on the outside, it's going to matter how you relate to the building as a place to live, and also how you think about yourself and the people that you dwell with. Also, this is something really important. He's very careful to articulate the possibility of individualism in this work. If you remember in the life of Brian, we are all individuals. This is a problem architects are constantly working about. So this one is, there's several that are in different color, and it's just a way of articulating the architect's interest in expressing the fact that everyone that lives in these houses does have an individual identity. So it's not only a strange complex that's been turned upside down, it's a strange complex that's been turned upside down in an effort to rethink the relationship between the individual and the collective. Now, maybe the most important house to begin starting this discussion, this is Villa Rotunda. So the problem of the relationship between the cube and the pyramid is really old. It will, in the 20th century, there'll be much, 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 much more interest in the cube. But this is Villa Rotunda, and it has certain things I want you to pay attention to, because we're now going to stop talking about ground and start talking about land. And ground and land are different. Ground is the thing you walk on. Land is the policies of social and political and legal life that are associated with the ground. So you live in a homeland. We have homeland security. You can't kill anybody for being on your ground, but you can kill somebody legally if they trespass on your land. So land is the place where political and social life find their power in their physical relationship to the ground. Now, architecture expresses this a lot. And so this building is basically pyramidal. It's bigger at the bottom than it is at the top. This staircase is really important because it establishes the ground as land. It's the feudal legacy of the land, we call it. In other words, it's the place. In feudalism, there were no landowners. There were people. People who held the land in terms of a profound entitlement, and then there are people that were owned by that person, not as slaves, but because they were attached to the land. So there's a big difference between capitalism and its relationship to the ground, and feudalism in its relationship to the ground. But most of the most profound architectural effects come out of that feudal relationship of establishing authority over the ground as land through its architectural expression. So it's bigger at the bottom. You can see it's it's rougher at the bottom. These columns are different from the top and the bottom. See, there's a base, there's a shaft, there's a capital. You walk up, this is now the new land, so to speak. So you've left the ground, but you maintain the authority of the ground. So everything about this building is asserting the significance of the ground as land and the power that the person inside that house has over that ground. This is the plan, however, and you can start to see the cube and the cube. This is the cube. It's actually exactly equal on all four sides. And it's very strange because there's no front door or back door. You walk in, and all of these are exactly the same. And that means this is now a place where you're not only going to see the house and understand the house in terms of the direct psychological experience of it, but you're going to think about it. There's no way to actually see the cube, or there's no way to actually experience the cube except when you go out. And you have to, know it, and you have to think about it. So this is a place where the abstraction and the intellectuality of the cube and the capacity of the pyramid to establish a certain place are starting to work at the same time. This is Palladio's Villa Rotunda. There's a few names I'm going to ask you to learn by the end of the quarter. Palladio is one of them. If you learn the 7 or 8 names, I ask you to learn by this quarter. You will know the 7 or 8 names that every other architect in the world knows, and that's the only ones they know. So I promise you, you will be able to hold your own. You'll just be able to walk in and say, I'm an architect. And they'll say, prove it, and you say those 7 names, and that's the end of it. Now, architects like to go, like everyone else, like for example, sampling in music, or architects like to go back and look at old work that we think we understand one way and see if we can understand them another way. So there is an architect named Bernard Chimney who was very interested in the relationship between architecture and film. In other words, he was thinking that the buildings in contemporary life are going to be better understood as stage sets. And particularly, what if you can build a building which is not like you build a library, but it's not a stage set for somebody that normally wants to go into a library. It's a stage set for a different kind of person. So you could start to criticize the institution by making a building look like a stage set for the wrong person in the institution. We're going to get back to that. But he did an analysis of this, and he understood this as a horror movie. Basically, it's like that Twilight Zone. I don't know if you've ever heard of Twilight Zone or seen Twilight Zone. There used to be this Twilight Zone where these people would be trapped in a city. They couldn't find anybody. Everything seemed fake. So finally, at the end of the show, they get on a train. The train's leaving. They're extremely happy to be leaving because they're finally, wherever you're going to go, they're going to get away from there. And then as it comes around the curve, it's pulling back into the exact same place. And so they realize they're trapped forever. And that's what happens in this house. You walk in the front door, and you find yourself at the front door. And you walk in the front door, and you're trapped. Wherever you go, there's a front but no back, and it's you can imagine it as being really scary. Well, when you're there, it's not all that scary, but it's fun to talk about scary. So you can see the cube. You can kind of see these relationships that we were talking about. And all of this, every piece of this ornamentation, all of the stuff that goes in it, these lines, every little bit of it, is reinforcing one aspect or another aspect of it. It's either reinforcing the cube or it's reinforcing the eventual pyramidal conclusion. And this is, we've already looked at this house, and I think if you remember, we first looked at this house in its relationship to this house because of this window. This house is, just so you know, this house is 1929, this house is 1963. So this house, as if you remember, we talked about this window being sort of intellectually looking like it was drawn from that. You can also see that it has certain relationships to these kinds of villas. So the pitched roof, and if you were to investigate this more and more and more, you would discover that relationship in this, there's a thing called the Vitruvian Drawing that's from, there's lots of different ways that this thing suggests its relationship to both of those conditions, to modern architecture and to the Renaissance architecture. But the weird thing, we're going to look at this house a little bit closer now. This house is a suburban house. This is a house for someone in the suburbs. Now, and the suburbs is going to be different than a house in the country. This is a house for the architect's mother. The architect's name is Venturi. It's the Vanna Venturi house. And there's this weird thing about the windows. The windows look like, they're all over the place. There's like bunches of them. So this window there's 5 of them here. So this is called a punch window. This is called a ribbon window. This is called a big window. Or, I don't know, a normal window. There's a technical term for it, and you'll learn it in your recitations. And if you look at it carefully, it looks like a collection. It doesn't make any sense. Then, as we explore it a little bit further, you notice that this is the driveway, this is the lawn. It seems like it cuts the thing in half. But if you look really carefully, when you get to the front door, what you think is going to be the front door, if you look right there, you think you're going to walk up, you're going to walk in the front door. You don't. You hit a dead end. And that's a very unusual entry. In a normal cottage, country cottage in particular, or lodge, you expect to walk in, go into the main space, and see a fireplace or see the arrival zone. Here you hit this dead end. And the dead end, so you drive down, you hit the building kind of weird instead of on the center. And then, I know it's hard to read a plan, but this is the best I can do. I can't read more than that. But look, you come in, you hit this dead end. Then you have to turn to enter. And once you turn to enter, you start to spiral around the house, and that's how you get up. And what ends up happening inside is, and here's the fireplace. So the place you expect to arrive at is actually the last place you're going to get to before you're going to come around here, you're going to see all this stuff. But in the meantime, you're going to see all this crap, all this collection of junk. Because in a suburban house, the person who lives in a suburban house, according to Venturi, is going to be very different than a person that lives in a small town or in a cottage house. People in small towns live in small towns because they want to know each other. They like the intimacy of a small number of people that know each other well, neighbors, gatherings. Suburbia is at least in this house, the suggestion is suburbia's got nothing to do with moving out in some place and liking your neighbors or wanting to be with your neighbors. Rather, it's moving out to some place and then collecting all the things that you want to build a little world of your own. And so there's a conjecture in this house that the person that lives in a suburbanite is very different than a ruralite. So she just comes in and sees all her stuff. And the house is designed, to give her this appreciation. The windows are like a collection of bad collection of windows, and the house is full of a bad collection of stuff that she really loves. It's her stuff. This table and this chair, these are, I don't know if you know anything about furniture, and I don't advise you to because I don't, but there are about 8 or 9 periods of furniture, all badly represented in cheap Ethan Allen reproductions. And she loves it, so what? Now, this is a house by Le Corbusier. This is maybe the most important house built in the 20th century. And we have to, first of all, I want you to notice how close it is to this. It's got, you see the center axis? See these little 2 bushes? I mean, it's intending to suggest a relationship to a Palladian villa. But of all the houses you're going to see, it's got it's the most like a cube. I mean, we will see other houses that come out of it, but this house is absolutely intended to not show any pyramidal qualities. And the reason for that is this. This is the guy's name, so you can write it down. He wrote this book. He wrote it, it's in French. In French, it's just called Towards an Architecture. I don't know why they put new in. Now, it's one of my favorite books, very easy to read. And this is my favorite chapter, Architecture or Revolution. So he's not saying, wow, I want to make a new style, or wow, I want to, I want to symbolize something. He's actually going to make an argument that architecture is sufficiently political that it can prevent revolutions. And he's arguing that this is going to come from modernity. Modernity is mass production. Instead of a few rich people being able to have what they want because it's handcrafted, everybody's going to be able to have very fine things because it can be mass produced. It's early in the 20th century. He's very much enthralled by the power of industry, standardization. But he sees architecture as having a crucial role, not just in taking advantage of that, but also stating a new kind of case for a relationship that will maybe think about the opposite of this. Remember, we talked about this as establishing the ground as land. And now all of these, where did I? Okay, so this is what it looked like a long time ago. This is what it looks like now, virtually unchanged. So, of course, it did turn into a ruin. It got to be so bad that they were going to tear it down, but the French government decided they didn't want to waste the money on tearing it down. And then all of a sudden, Le Corbusier got really famous again, and then they redid it. But there are 5 points that he says towards a modern architecture. And they are, you don't have to write this down. You can write it down. If you actually can name Le Corbusier and the 5 points, you will appear to be not only an architect, but like a professor. So, I'm going to tell them to you in English. They are flat roof. This is called a ribbon window. We've already kind of talked about the ribbon window. These, instead of columns, these are called pilotis, P-I-L-O-T-I-S. So instead of 6 columns that have a differentiating between the bottom and the top, These are abstracted, round, no difference between the top and the bottom, and there's a whole field of them. Free facade just means there's not any ornamentation on the outside of it. And then there's a thing called free plan. Free plan means basically it's empty. So as you enter here, and then you spiral up the same way, but basically as much as possible, the rooms are left free to the life and imagination of the occupants. It becomes even more radical in some other houses. But those are the 5 points: flat roofs, ribbon windows, pilotis, free facade, free of ornamentation, and free plan. Now, they are a formula for doing exactly the opposite of this. So the reason he's going to such effort to call attention to that other house is because he's trying to do exactly the opposite. He's trying to disestablish the ground as land. He's trying to end the relationship between the house and the ground in such a way that it establishes an authoritative power relationship associated with revolution called land. And the way he does that is does everything architecture can do to erase the pyramidal diagram. He gets rid of the columns, he makes a field, he makes a flat roof. The ribbon window erases the sky and the ground. He puts a rooftop garden. Did I say rooftop garden? Oh. Did I say 5? Flat roofs. Oh yeah, rooftop garden. See, I'm not only a professor, I'm one of the most famous professors in all the world, and I miss these 5 points. So you can say, no, Jeff, you meant rooftop garden. And you'd be right. And then I'd give you a lower grade for insulting me, but nevertheless. So there's supposed to be a little garden up here that you go up to, and it's a rooftop garden, meaning it's not, so watch what happens. So if there's a rooftop garden and the plan is basically like the ground and the ground is like the ground and all the ways that the building articulates a relationship to the ground are erased, then this piece of flatness and this piece of flatness up here and then the floors inside, they all become the same thing. And so if you can cause that to happen, if you can leave the ground and then erase the significance of the ground, then you've changed the ground from something called land into something we call a datum, meaning that the top of the thing and the middle of the thing and the bottom thing they're just 3 different examples of a place to do something. Datum, data. I don't know why they call it that. Mostly we call stuff in Latin, so we can charge money for it, like lawyers. So everything about this house is contesting the problem of the ground as land and trying to turn it into a datum. And it was his idea at the time that was going to change our relationship to that was a new politics of architecture. That was an architecture about democracy. So he created something called an equipotential field. It's about democracy, not about freedom. Now that is allowed. Is that me? Whose was that? Confess. You get an A. Okay, you get an A. Good ringtone. Report yourself to your TA as having earned an A for good ringtones. I have to tell you, I don't like people to turn their phones off, but what I really wish would happen was everybody would turn their phone on and set your alarm and have them all ring at the same time. It would be like angels, wouldn't it? It would be so wonderful. Do any of you have an iPhone? Do you have a harp setting on your iPhone? Harp. Oh, this is fantastic. That's my alarm clock too. Oh, I didn't bring it. Look for harp. I wake up every morning to angels playing harp. And then my snooze is fire alarm. Okay. Now these are 2 other great works of modern architecture houses. And if you know these 3 things, we're going to be able to explain virtually every house or every building we see by just understanding these 3 buildings. Okay, and the real difference between them, and just pay attention to this. Oh, I forgot one thing. Look how high this is off the ground. I'll get to you in a second. And then this is lower, but off the ground, and you'll see, and then this is on the ground. So these three houses are really going to fight with each other about modernity, about democracy, about freedom, about architecture's goal, what it can actually do for society, in part by how far they get off the ground. But one thing I want you to notice about the 5 points. It's very obvious once you realize it, because if you're going to talk about the most important things that you're talking about a house, if you're going to talk about a building and you're going to talk about its most important features architecturally, you are going to talk about the windows, and you're going to talk about the structure, and you're going to talk about the basic shape and what the plan inside is like. But there's one thing you always talk about. Look. What is the most important and most obvious thing about this building? Who said that? Okay, good. Are you in this for a grade or? Yeah. Tell your TA you get an A. I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah, the most important thing about the stairs. Which is really about what? It's really about how you enter the building. Okay? Now, if you notice, you can't see how you enter the building here. You can't find the front door. Now, the one thing you would always talk about if you're an architect is the entry sequence, or the entry promenade, or the door. Doors are really important. They're almost as important as windows, and particularly how you leave outside and go inside. But he has to hide it. It's hidden in this black zone. You can't ever see it. You can see it in the plan. Look, it says entry right here. Somewhere it says entry, right there. See that? But it's hard as hell to find even in that thing. Now, why is that? Anybody got an idea? You? Come on, make up something. Here's the difference between any other field and ours, and that is, if you make up something, you're right. All you got to do is just try to make it up. Why wouldn't he show the door? Go ahead. Absolutely right. So you not only get an A, you're graduated.
Yeah, great.
Pick up your degree, pick up your license. You can start building buildings tomorrow. What's your name? Jane? J-A-E? I'm going to tell you the honest truth, and you ask all my graduate students, and they're all students over there. You are the first person ever to get that right in a class. Okay? Now, in a certain sense, that's all there is to this, because it seems like it gets more complicated, but it's really not that complicated. The real problem is to keep it simple. So if he shows the door, he has to show a relationship to the ground that he's gone a whole lot of way to avoid. Very good. Now, these two buildings have very obvious entries, big doors, big staircases, and yet they're black and white, meaning they are good and evil in architecture. This is by an architect named Mies van der Rohe. His whole name is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. When I started in architecture, I didn't know that. I thought his first name was Mies, and his last name was der Rohe. And I kept trying to look him up in the books. I had to go to class and teach about him. I didn't know, and I couldn't find him. Couldn't find his name in the library or anything. Until someone finally said, no, his whole last name is Mies van der Rohe. And this is a guy named Philip Johnson, an old friend of mine who died a few years ago. And this is the Glass House in New Canaan, and this is the Farnsworth House in Illinois. All these things you can go see. Every one of these things is private property, and they all say don't come in. And so the fun thing is you go in, you pay the guy $5 to see it, or you run down there real fast and touch it and run away. Philip Johnson was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, and he did a show about Mies van der Rohe. And while he was looking at the drawings of Mies van der Rohe, he found the drawings for this house in 1947. And he realized that the first person to build a glass house was going to get an enormous amount of publicity. And so he ran out, quit the museum, built this house, got it built first. This got built in 1951. But he did it in such a way as to actually articulate a really interesting set of arguments about this building. It's on the ground. See? This is off the ground. But this is off the ground differently than the Villa Savoye, the house we saw before. You can see it floats on the ground, but you've got to go up. You go up here. You go up a staircase. And you go up a big staircase, and you get up there. You see nature through a void. And then you turn, and you go inside the glass house. Whereas when you're entering the when you're entering the glass house, I'm sorry. I'll do this again. You go up the staircase, you see the void, you turn, and then you enter the Farnsworth House. Now, Edith Farnsworth, a lot of these houses were Edith Farnsworth had a crush on Mies van der Rohe. She built the house to help him, and because she had a crush on him. By the time he finished the house, he'd spent so much money and taken so long, she didn't have a crush on him anymore. And she never lived there. So no one there. It's oftentimes great works of architecture pretty much suck as places to live. But it's absolutely fabulous to go to. Whereas with Philip's house, Philip was gay, had a great lover named David Whitney. David Whitney was in Andy Warhol's. Go see that show. He was part of the factory. And if you read Andy Warhol's diaries, you can read this section where David and Andy are planning to kill Philip, steal his money, and run away together. So it's an interesting world. They didn't do it, by the way. But notice that this has certain features that it's a cube, but look, this is a cube with open-ended, goes on forever. So the slab of space it establishes is infinitely long, very much like the Villa Savoye trying to make a slab of space that's very long, whereas this is really closed off. It's a box, hard box with hard corners. It's highly reflective. You can see all kinds of reflections. The glass he chose is meant to be highly reflective, like a mirror, so it turns everything around it into kind of a wallpaper. In other words, it's not free facade. It's really highly ornamented, but it's highly ornamented with all these tree reflections. Whereas this is a very clear glass. When you're inside of it, it almost looks like you're outside. And I guess the most important thing is this chimney. Now, it's important for two reasons. One is it's made of brick. Brick is associated with the ground, you know? So you don't see any chimneys there. If you look real carefully, there's a little service core, but in most views, they try to hide it because it's actually not part of the architecture. He wants it to be this slab is exactly equal to this slab, and that they define this infinite zone of space that you come off the ground and you go up into. Now, this is something very different than Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier's is kind of a conceptual idea where the ground and the roof and the floors become the same thing. But he was naive in the sense that it actually did it. It's more about thinking about it. Whereas when you come here and you go up this gigantic staircase and you get on this, inside this building, you feel like you're on stage. And it is a dramatic feeling. Anybody want to experience it? Anybody want to experience the dramatic feeling of being on stage? Would you like to? You're not okay. Come on. Here. We got to get you up here. Come on, get it. This is an architecture class. Now, how does that feel?
Pretty good. Yeah, it's all right.
It's pretty good, isn't it? It's really different, though, isn't it? Not only do you feel everybody staring at you, but you kind of look down on the world. You feel like you're a different character, don't you? You can feel it. And that relationship of being on stage and not on stage is really a measure of the distance and how much you can see. Here, let me help you out. Okay. Did you like that?
Yeah, it was all right.
Did you love it?
A little bit.
If you didn't love it, okay, you get a B. You got to love it. You got to love it to get an A. Okay, so that's the principle of this house. The house is really different than the other house. So big windows, so you can see everything, not ribbon windows. And a staircase that absolutely makes it a heroic exit from the ground. Now this house, you go in, and there's the brick. See, this is a brick on the bottom, and the brick turns into the floor, and the floor turns into this chimney, and all of a sudden you get the pyramidal diagram back. So in architecture, that chimney is one of the great controversies of the 20th century because it violates all the principles of modern architecture. It reestablishes the importance of the ground. And in fact, this building is a building about how you can use all the materials of modern architecture, glass, steel, reflectivity, to produce the most traditional kind of house. It actually has 3 floors. You can see one there. There's a kind of midsection, and then there's a top. So this chair rail is like wainscoting. It's like a decoration on walls. And so the idea that Philip has was he was completely anti-modern, completely anti-democratic. He was concerned for architecture's ability to establish the importance of power and wealth. He was very wealthy, and he showed incontestably that the same language of architecture could be used against the idea, glass and steel. There's the corners. See how tight, that's just like going into this, like this corner, all the corners here. Instead of being open, it's hermetically sealed. This entry is based on Greek planning. In other words, you enter on the oblique. These are the doors. But you see it at an angle, whereas with the Farnsworth House, you always see it frontally when you get in, when you come up to it. Okay. Then why we were studying that, because we're going to go back to this house, which I showed you originally. Now, if you look carefully at this house, it's Villa Savoye on the top and the glass house on the bottom. So he's taken those 2 houses that we've just seen, and now he's going to discuss the problems with them. And how is he going to discuss it? First thing he's going to do is, this door is a sliding door, and this door is a sliding door. So when this door slides like this, and that door slides like that, it changes from this with a closed corner. There's Philip and David right there. They used to sit there. You see all these trees out here? They would sit there, and they'd pick the tree. They would cut trees down, like 1 or 2 a year, to try to make it more beautiful. You know, instead of having a kind of dense wall of trees, you could see. And that's what their hobby was, to sort of sit here. And there's a gigantic cliff over on the side. Something else you wouldn't. The Farnsworth House is sitting right in the middle of a piece of ground, no cliff. There's a river near it. It floods. I don't know if I have that view. Where was I?
Middle of the lava
Corner. Yeah, good. So this corner, which is wide open, is radically different than this corner. And Rem is interested, Rem Koolhaas, another name I'm going to ask you to learn, is interested in why is it that architects didn't pay attention to stuff like moving sliding glass doors or elevators. His question was, why don't we pay attention to the real stuff of buildings and use them to make architecture? And so as a kind of joke, as a kind of discussion with other architects, he uses the sliding glass doors to turn one house into the other, and therefore uses this kind of new invention as a way of undoing that discussion. But most importantly, it's a discussion of how far you are off the ground and the relationship to the ground. But it's also, if you look how it's built, look at these. This is built, all of these houses are built, these 3 houses, see this completely abstract as a kind of pure form. And if it's not, it's built with, it's painted all one color to give it a kind of ideality and permanence. And all the corners are completely resolved, whether you do it like this or you're like this. In other words, this column is at this corner and this column is off the corner, but this column is a kind of I-beam. Notice it's not the same as a pillow T. It's not round, but it's also, all of these columns are exactly the same at the bottom and at the top. Whereas in Villa de Lava, this corner, if you look at it, it's just corrugated sheet metal, and there's no detail at the end. It's just put together. The thing looks like it was just built quickly out of a kit of parts. It's not about being permanent. It's not about being ideal. It's about being sort of realistic now. And the question about this is this, so those other architectures were architectures about democracy. This is a shift in architecture away from democracy, much like the suburban house, towards a notion of freedom. In other words, instead of reestablishing the ground as an equipotential field, as a place of equality, all he's trying to do is remove all the ways architecture exercises authority over you. So if you know, so you see the quote, but so this is the window that slides open, and you get and then here are all the columns. So they're kind of tilted columns. They're silly. They're pillow-T, but they're not straight up and down. They're in color. They're holding up this bar here. And then if you look over here, it's exactly the same thing with no columns. So all the ways that architecture would establish a kind of permanent regime, would not do any tricks, would be ideal, would be perfect, this house is making fun of. Plus, this is the mother's room. This is the father's room. And I'm not sure in the back and front. This is the daughter's room, or I got them backwards. There's 3 separate rooms, and you'll work that out in your recitations. Find the 3 rooms. There's 3 members of the family. There's a father, a daughter, and a mother. Each have their own places in the house. There is no living room or dining room. There's no place where they all come together as a family. In fact, the easiest way for them to communicate with one another is through these windows. So if he wants to speak to his daughter, he stands up here and he talks up to her. So everything about the house is critiquing the idea of a permanent ideal world in which families live together. Here, members of a family come together, live in a space almost like an apartment, meet each other casually and without formality, and leave again. It's a much more about letting the house not establish the authority of the nuclear family, but dissolving it a little bit. If you look up here, I don't know if you can see it because of the light, this is the rooftop garden, this is how funny things become. Or I don't know if you think they're funny. See this little form right here? That's part of the rooftop garden? He's put it on top of his form. Is that the right one? Tell me where I'm then. It's right there. He's kind of made the same shape, but he's made it out of a construction site plastic fence. Again, reinforcing the idea that it's not permanent, that it's in the city, that things are getting built all the time and change all the time, and that that freedom comes from that. Freedom comes from change and impermanence and a dynamic relationship between the individual and the collective. Okay, this is a house. These are terrible pictures, I'm sorry, but I'll go 5 more minutes because I was late. This is called the Miller House. It was done by a member of our faculty named José Ubre. He's a kind of a heavy-set French guy. And if you come study with us, you get to study with him. And what's really fantastic about that is, even though he's been in the United States for 20 years, he was the dean at Kentucky. He's a world-famous architect. He just opened a building called a church that he started with Le Corbusier. He used to work for Le Corbusier. The building sat unfinished for 40 years, and he finally got it finished. Became the most photographed and best regarded building of the year last year. Despite all that stuff, you can't understand what he's saying. But no one can understand what he's saying, but it's fun to hang around with him. He's one of the most fun people to hang around with. You get to hang around with him all you want, and you don't have to understand what he's saying. But you can still learn a lot from him. Now, this is a house in Kentucky. This is when he worked for Le Corbusier, they did this house. It's called the Mill Owner's House. And you'll notice it looks like that, just like this looks like Villa Savoye. So all architects are always using stuff from previous architects in order to comment on the next generation. And what's really weird about this house, if you pay attention, is that it's got all these different staircases. It's got 3 different staircases. And instead of having one staircase, it's a grand entry, it has 3 staircases plus a front door. And if you look at that, each of the bedrooms there are all these separate apartments. So this is an apartment with its own staircase. This is an apartment with its own staircase. Exactly the same idea. The concrete represents the city. It's kind of an urban matrix. And then each member of the family has their own apartment in white and their own separate entry and staircase to it. So it is, I wouldn't say it's disestablishing the ground. It's indifferent to the problem of the ground. It's actually producing a miniature city in the middle of Lexington, Kentucky, where all the members of the family come and go. No one else the son can get in without any of the parents knowing, vice versa. Everyone has their own staircase. And then they meet, casually meet, sort of on these staircases in the middle, as if they're walking in a city on different floors. And there is no main kitchen, no main dining room. It goes all the way to the point of these gigantic fireplace. This is the fireplace flue. Then he ends one here to reinforce the idea that you're outside when you're inside. Now that we've discussed the cube, this is the last house I think I'm going to show you today. Let me show you this last one, and then we'll take up the problem next week. This is House 2 by Peter Eisman. This is the guy who designed the Wexner Center, which we will discuss further. This is clearly a house about the cube, but instead of being about the cube in the ways that we've seen it already as a device for arguing against the ground, he's taking advantage of its radical abstraction. And all of a sudden, he's thinking about an architecture, not that you get the architectural effect by going to it or understanding it while you're there or experiencing it. You have to understand this building by the way it was designed. So he's taken the cube and then put it through these processes. There's 52 of these drawings, and it's all about how you subdivide a cube and all the various formal relationships that you can get out of a cube. And then in the end, he builds it. And in other words, it's not about setting up any views. He has no regard whatsoever for how it's going to meet the site or the ground. It's just, this is a piece of abstract exercise, taking advantage of the abstraction of the cube, because in his mind, the best way architecture can set you free is to absolutely get you involved in the question of understanding who you are in relationship to power relationships. This is a radical disestablishment, not so much of the ground, but of architecture's relationship to power by turning it into an intellectual exercise. The more you understand about this house, the more the house is doing its architectural work. And you cannot understand anything about this house unless you're not there. You have to be reading about it in a book. You have to be looking at these diagrams. Then, when you're there, it's fun. It's fun to see. It's fun to go around. There's a column that goes through the bedroom. Goes through the middle of the bed. It completely assaults the idea that anything about your life or your experience or your relationship to your domestic practices should govern the idea of the house. Why not live in a work of abstract sculpture? Okay, we're going to call it quits today. Remember, next time, plan on staying 20 more minutes. Thank you.